Okay, so before anything else, in recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day and at the request of tonight's speakers, we will start with a land acknowledgement. So the land acknowledgement is, every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the Asian American Studies program and the Office of Multicultural Involvement and Community Advocacy, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those who have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge a truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral land of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on Indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us together here today. Great, thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Park, and I'm the Director of the Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland, where we are currently celebrating our 20th anniversary. We welcome you to tonight's dialogue, The Fight Against Anti-Blackness and the Pursuit of Cross-Racial Solidarity, Asian Americans in Racial Justice Work. We are fortunate to have our two speakers tonight, not only for their amazing work in this area, but also because they were both an integral part of the student activism that led to the starting of our program at UMD. Just to give you a little background about our speakers, Dr. Rossina Zamora Liu is faculty in the Minority and Urban Education specialty in the Department of Teaching and Learning, Leadership and Policy at the University of Maryland. Her scholarship focuses on interrogating the onto-epistemologies of white supremacy, centering critical race theory, counter-storytelling, and fostering cross-racial coalition among Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. She received the J. Michael Parker Award from the Literacy Research Association for her ethnographic essay on humanizing the witnessing of trauma narratives. She is co-author of a forthcoming book, The Psychology of Privilege, White Supremacy and Power, and guest co-editor for two forthcoming journal special issues, Anti-Blackness in English Curriculum, Practice and Culture, in English Teaching, Practice and Critique, as well as Race, in parentheses, Towards Futurity, Black and Latinx Youth's Multimodal Compositions of Future Selves and Literacies in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. And also, Dr. William Ming Liu is professor and chair of the Department of Counseling, Higher Education, and Special Education at the University of Maryland. His research focuses on social class and classism, men and masculinity, and white supremacy and privilege. He is the editor of the Handbook of Multicultural Competencies in Counseling and Psychology, and editor of Culturally Responsive Counseling with Asian American Men, the author of Social Class and Classism in the Helping Professions, Research, Theory, and Practice, the editor of the Handbook of Social Class and Counseling, and co-author of the forthcoming book, The Psychology of Privilege, White Supremacy and Power. He serves as the editor for the APA journal, Psychology of Men and Masculinity. He's a fellow of Division 17 and 51. So we welcome all of you. We are especially happy to have our two speakers. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping issues. There are quite a few people already logged on, so please use the Q&A feature if you would like to ask a question. I will do my best to group them to be able to ask our speakers after their presentation. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Dr. Rossina Liu and Dr. Will Liu.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for showing up and joining us on Indigenous Peoples Day. My name is Rossina Zamora Liu, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
And I'm William Ming Liu, and my pronouns are he, him, his.
We want to echo Dr. Julie Park on the land acknowledgement and express our deepest respect for the Piscataway people, to their elders, and to their ancestors. We want to acknowledge the history of violence that has been and continues to be enacted on Indigenous peoples in the US. As we engage today in our conversations on Asian Americans in racial justice work, the genocide of Indigenous peoples in the US and the theft of their land are very much part and present in shaping how we're understanding the liberation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. As people who identify as Asian Americans in the Academy, William and I are very honored to be here today and to be in your company, however remotely. Thank you to the Asian American Studies Program and the Office of Multicultural Involvement and Community Advocacy at Maryland for inviting and giving us space for this dialogue. A special thanks to Dr. Julie Park and Dr. Janelle Wong and Dr. Terry Park, Jessica Lee, and Dorothy Ko for making this happen. And then, of course, personally, I also want to do a special shout out to my Black and BIPOC sisters and brothers who are here with us today. Dr. Tara Brown, Dr. Stephanie Timmons Brown, Dr. Claudia Galindo, Dr. Jennifer Turner, Dr. Ebony Terrell Shockley, Dr. April Baker Bell, Dr. Stephanie Jones, and Dr. Tisha Lewis Ellison. Thank you so much for showing up and all of those of you who are here. We also want to give a special thanks to our students with whom we've had the privilege of working across 2 institutions, and also to our BIPOC sisters and brothers whose geniuses and brilliances continue to teach us and bring us to these conversations today. So thank you very much, our deepest gratitude. Today let's see. Okay, that's okay. All right, today we want to begin with our position statement on matters of Asian Americans in racial justice work. We know that where we start in this discourse determines where we land. As such, we declare that the liberation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US must start with the fight against anti-Blackness. To the extent that we all may want and be seeking for social justice, let us be very clear today that there is no social justice without Black racial justice. And so with this as our starting point, we will draw from our forthcoming book, The Psychology of White Supremacy, White Privilege and Power with Oxford University Press, to inform us on the functions of anti-Black racism within the US, and importantly, who we are as Asian Americans within this context. We will also try to address some of the questions that many in our communities have posed and expressed. For example, where do Asian Americans fit into the racial discourse and racial justice work? How do we talk about anti-Asian racism and violence while also fighting against anti-Blacks? Certainly, these are questions that are not unique. They are questions that we often hear in the media, in our communities, and in our classrooms. As Asian Americans committed to racial justice, however, William and I recognize the intersecting histories of racism among Black, Brown, Indigenous, and non-Black communities of color. And so to these questions, we offer a counterpose. In what ways does fighting against anti-Blackness render Asian Americans invisible at all? To understand this counter, we invite you to take on a critical racial perspective, and that require you to critical introspection and reflexivity. For the purposes of this dialogue today, we're going to focus on a couple of critical assumptions of critical race theory. First, that racism is permanent and it is endemic. Second, racism must be understood as systemic and structural, meaning that racism is reserved for the power of whiteness and white supremacy and white institutions. In fact, so in other words, while BIPOC individuals may endorse and participate in race-based acts, for example, we as individuals do not hold any permanent power and therefore cannot be racist in the sense of how we understand structural racism to operate. In fact, any power that's held by BIPOC individuals is contingent on our proximity to whiteness and white institutions. Outside of these sponsored spaces, such as the university, the primary identities prescribed to William and I, for example, are as non-whites, which also implies that any power and privileges that's granted to us are only as stable and as real as the institution that endorses and grants them to us. To this end, we refer to these contingent privileges as proxy privileges, which are not to be mistaken as white racial privilege or any kind of racial privilege for that matter. The third critical racial assumption that we make is that racism has explicit functions within a white supremacist state. In other words, racism is not just there because bad people hate and good people don't hate. Rather, because racism is structural and systemic, racism functions to protect whiteness and benefit the white property and white economic interests. Fourth, and finally, if we are to fully understand racism as structural and as a mechanism intended to uphold white supremacy, then we must also root white supremacy and racism in anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is not just simply a kind of racist sentiment against Black people and Black communities in current and historical times, nor is it just a set of value systems and belief systems. Anti-Blackness is the through line on which white supremacy exists, survives, and thrives. And it has deeply rooted historical, political, cultural, social, linguistic, and economical consequences. In the US, anti-Blackness is something that white supremacy exploits to entice BIPOCs to engage in return for material rewards. At the core, anti-Blackness is used to solicit our consent to our own oppressions, as well as those of our Black and brown sisters and brothers. This is not to say that people of color do not harbor or participate in anti-Blackness. This is only to say that individual actions and behaviors are not to be conflated with systemic and structural power that endorses and encourages and protects their perpetuation. To do so would be to relegate anti-Blackness and other forms of racism to abnormal, bad behaviors and interpersonal exchanges without fully interrogating how it actually operates to maintain asymmetrical power dynamics in the US. Rendered another way, if we minimize racism to simply interpersonal matters of bad actions versus good actions, then the flip side to that is simply to just not be bad, and at best to be kind and nice. Yet, while good will and good intentions may be revered in racial justice work, we know that change rarely happens, nor can it be sustained if we are simply relying on individualistic frameworks of saviorism. Instead, we must examine anti-Blackness and other forms of racism in terms of material gains and losses, those that which are promised and or withdrawn for our participation in and or rejection of subscribing to them. More to the point, to do so means to acknowledge and interrogate the ways that we, as Asian Americans, can be seduced by proxy privileges by way of our model minority designation. Next slide. To frame our conversation today, William and I are borrowing from the work of Dr. Love and Dr. Muhammad, who remind us that in order to cultivate meaningful and engaging conversations about race and racism, the conversation must be historicized, it must be intersectional, and it must disrupt colonized thinking. As we go through this dialogue, then, we invite you to think about some questions inspired by Dr. Love's and Dr. Muhammad's brilliance, but we've also modified them for the purposes of this webinar. Appropriately, as this year marks the 20th anniversary of a movement that was started 30 years ago, we will begin with the founding of the Asian American Studies program here at Maryland. As a key figure in its founding, William will discuss the socio-political climate of our Asian American communities at the time. What you will see is how the socio-political climate among Asian American communities have, in some ways, remained similar insofar as their various frameworks. Particularly with the upcoming general election, we can see how tensions continue to persist among our Asian American communities, from identifying priorities to confronting what's at stake for us. For us in the 1990s, which I know is a very long time ago, and I know that dates us, where we found support was from the Black Student Union and the BIPOC student groups on campus. The Black Student Union and other BIPOC student groups were among the key resources and communities who showed up for us, with us, and who helped propel our movement to action. Of course, this is not to say that it was all smooth sailing, that these coalitions were without tensions, or that the other groups didn't suspect or had suspicion about our motivations. Thus, there was a lot of engaging in consistent dialogue with one another. And so from this position, our position, the founding of the Asian American Studies program here at Maryland offers a critical space and time to consider matters such as who needs to be at in this conversation around cross-racial solidarity, and in particular, where do Asian Americans fit in this conversation? How do we participate in additive and impactful ways? In order to consider our participation, we must be able to confront the contradictions of our proxy privileges as model minorities and at once as the perpetual foreigners. How do these precarious positionalities facilitate and impede our fight against anti-Blackness? How do we resist and fight against it? Next slide. To continue these examinations, William will briefly discuss the inception of the Asian American Studies program by first overviewing the socio-political climate at the time, followed by a deeper, more in-depth conversation on proxy privileges.
Thank you. So the movement for the establishment of Asian American Studies happened almost 30 years ago. Next year will be the start of would have been 30 years since we started the movement to establish an Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland. And the establishment of an academic program at a predominantly white institution is not just the installation or the implementation of an academic program, but also it is the transformation of a predominantly white space. And so when we think about decolonization, there's nothing more decolonizing of a white space than to insert the prominence of ethnic studies into that space. And so as part of that conversation, as part of that movement, it was really important to develop a coalition. But that coalition happened as a result of a small group of people. Alongside that small group of people that were developing the Asian American Studies program, one of the important aspects of our implementation, our ability to establish an Asian American Studies program, was coalition building across the other racial ethnic communities on campus. And part of that too was that the importance of being able to disrupt multiple spaces simultaneously. And that was an important part of it, so that when we went to administrators and we went to the campus to ask for resources and to talk about Asian American studies, they had to address multiple constituent groups. And so they couldn't just write off one group over another. And that was a critical piece. The other part too that I was engaged in were multiple conversations. And those multiple conversations involved different overlapping Asian American communities. And so one of the Asian American communities that we had to work with were what I consider to be the sort of very Asian-centric, Asian American-centric students and faculty, where they understood the importance of Asian American studies. They also were very much invested in Asian American issues, but the limitation of their perspective was that they were only interested in Asian American issues to the exclusion of understanding our larger multiracial communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, and Latinx communities as well. And so in some ways, it's interesting because as I was thinking about this presentation, it also reflected in many ways some of the continuing conversations that I see reflected in multiple sort of social media platforms. So for instance, one of our favorite social media platforms tends to be this group called on Instagram, Asians Never Die. And they're good on a lot of different aspects, but one of the things that we found really troubling was that they promoted, or at least they published, these anti-Asian violence videos that were caused by Black aggressors, the Black folks that were causing the violence. And they didn't frame it, they didn't discuss it, they just sort of put it out there. And I thought they missed a really good opportunity to really frame and enliven and really talk about what this particular violence was and is. And this particular violence, of course, is related to the COVID mess that our current administration has pinned on Chinese as the Chinese virus. And so still the Asian American centric group was really important because those were largely the students that were interested in coming to courses. There's also the Asian American model minority group, and these were the folks that would come up to us during protest movements and come up to us when we were outdoors sort of publicizing the Asian Student Union, Asian American Student Union, and tell us that we were doing the wrong thing, that we were not supposed to engage in these larger political discussions. We weren't supposed to be visible. And instead we were supposed to work hard and just be quiet minorities. So really reinforcing the idea that being the model minority was the way to go. And then the last group is a group that I call sort of the Asian-centric individuals. And these folks were really interested in they acknowledged that Asian Americans experience racism, but rather than focusing on discussing Asian American racism in any particular way, what they wanted to do was focus on Asian supremacy. And so as a way to combat anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian racism, what they wanted to do was they wanted to develop courses where we addressed and focused on the economic prominence of countries on the Pacific Rim, and how we should teach Asian American students to be proud of our heritage because we're economically successful. And you would think in some ways that those individuals who were focused on this kind of Asian supremacy would be at odds with folks who subscribe to white supremacy. But in many ways, we find that that's not necessarily the case in our contemporary society, that they find themselves in very parallel courses with very convergent interests and convergent agendas, in part because they focus on anti-Blackness. You see that in the discussions around affirmative action. their focus is on inserting Asian Americans as a victimized minority group, victimized more so than African Americans, and therefore they deserve a particular kind of special treatment. And so these sort of Asian-centric folks, these folks that were focused on Asian supremacy, found an alliance, found convergence with those who, in the conservative movement, conservative white political movements. But it's interesting too, I think, as we think about the various communities within the Asian American, the larger Asian American community, one of the things that is a constant struggle among Asian Americans is the movement between our ethnic identities as well as our larger subscription to racial identity, the racial identity of as Asian Americans. And so I think there's this, we have to recognize, and many of us do acknowledge that as Asian Americans, we're constantly being reinforced, our ethnic identities, our national identities are constantly being reinforced by immigration patterns. And that's okay. That's not something that we should be ashamed of, but it is something unique in terms of the Asian American community that is somewhat different than in the Latinx community, the Black community, or the Indigenous community. Whereas for Asian Americans, we have to sort of grapple with this idea of, at what point does our ethnic identities help us make sense of racism in America? And at what point do we gravitate towards and subscribe to a larger Asian American label? And one of the things that I think we can do to help us along those lines is see the ways in which our ethnic heritages and our ethnic identities converge at points with the ethnic histories and racial histories in the United States, and at points diverge, but in those points of divergence, help us understand and inform who we are as Asian Americans in America. So for instance, one of the things that we might be able to consider is, if we take a particular point in history, we can situate Asian Americans within that point of history globally as well as the United States. So for instance, in the 1950s, 1954, we have a huge decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, that happened in the United States that was a point in time that offered a very limited kind of desegregation policy for Black Americans in the United States. And what was also happening globally in 1954 was something that happened all the way across the world in Vietnam, which was in 1954, we have Dien Bien Phu, which is the fall of the French Empire. Now that's significant for the United States because up to that point, the United States had doubled down on supporting French colonialism. So they were engaged in a practice that they didn't have any problems with because they thought, yeah, colonialism has always worked for us, so why not double down and support the French colonialists to recolonize Vietnam and go in there and disregard the needs of the Vietnamese there and instead support European colonialism in its stead. And so it's interesting, so Asian Americans do in many ways have a history of colonialism, and we have to see that our histories and our understanding of colonialism abroad were very much informed by colonial practices that occurred in the United States. They didn't just happen. They're just not spontaneous events that occurred, but these were informed practices in the United States that happened among Black and Indigenous populations, and then were extended outwards across the world. And those practices across the world also then came back and informed or continued colonization and racist practices in the United States. And so what that means for us as a larger Asian American community, especially under the BIPOC label, is that, one of the things that we might want to try to understand is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color is not necessarily meant as a term of representation. I think it's used synonymously for that, but also it's more than that. It's more than just representation. And one of the ways that we like to understand it is that when we use the term Black, Indigenous, and other people of color at BIPOC, it is an establishment, it's inserting a particular sort of epistemology that we understand that our lives, our sense of who we are as people of color, as Asian Americans in the United States, are very much informed by the practices and policies and dehumanization and genocide that occurred as a result of American racism against Black and Indigenous populations. And so as Asian Americans, we have this continued struggle of trying to understand and trying to configure who we are as Asian Americans with this robust ethnic identity that's constantly happening within our community. And so I want to go to this idea of the model minority, which I think many of us understand is a problematic descriptor for Asian Americans. And we talk about, the way that we sort of describe it here is that the model minority is incredibly seductive. And at the point in time that the model minority image or the myth of the model minority or the sort of stereotype of the model minority came about and was inserted, it came at a time in the United States where Asian Americans were coming into America, into the United States, after almost 30, 35, 40 years of war with Asia, right? So from the 1940s with the war against Japan, to the Korean War, to 1954 and the start of the Vietnam conflict, up to 1975, that's decades of war against Asians, and the sort of American culture at the time was built up to see Asians as the enemy alien. And so the model minority, the importance of the model minority is that it offered Asians coming into America and Asians in the United States a proximity to whiteness that protected them in some ways, apart from that hatred against Asians, right? Because of the sort of long-term war presence against Asia. That's one piece. But also offered them positionality and offered them a place next to white people in white spaces with privileges that was mostly all positive in descriptions, right? And so it gave them an opportunity, gave Asian Americans a position, an automatic position, something that they didn't even have to fight for. It was just there. And Asian Americans could just step into it. And the way that they could maintain that model minority position was to engage in anti-Blackness, right? That they could lean into this model minority image and really fulfill it and say that, yeah, we should be the model minority, and that other minority groups, other racial ethnic groups should conform to the way that we're doing things. In a sense, because we are the model minority, meritocracy, the status quo, is legitimate and is valid and it works, and we should all adhere to it. The model minority also means that we have a particular kind of positionality in white space, in white organizations, in white institutions as well. And that space isn't just sort of, the space that I'm talking about isn't just a kind of abstract notion, but we really have to think about it as literal proximity to whiteness and white people in actual white space. Because one of the things that, if we think about Love and Muhammad's conversation that Rossina started us off with in terms of decolonization, decolonization has to be linked to the idea of territory and land and space. It cannot just be an abstract notion of decolonization or confronting racism. That's not enough, because our indigenous scholars tell us that colonization is about land and territory, about land theft, territorial occupation, And so when we think about territory, when we think about decolonization, we really have to talk about it as literal space, white space that we're occupying. And in what ways do Asian Americans as the model minority help to configure, maintain, and perpetuate white spaces? And in that way, the way that we go about doing that is participating in anti-Blackness. It's a way that we believe, not only through economic and educational gains, but it's a way that we believe that we can earn racial privileges. And from our perspective, our sort of a theoretical perspective around critical race theory and white supremacy and white privilege, it is very clear that you cannot earn racial privileges. That's not how it works. It's never worked that way. Instead, what people earn are proxy privileges. They earn contingent privileges. They earn positional power. They earn they get a particular kind of power, but that particular power is limited to people, white people, but also limited to space, contingency, right? And so outside of those spaces and outside of those places, you're no longer the privileged person. Instead, you are Asian person. So for instance, as an example, back in my old institution, one of the things that, so I used to teach a privilege from the standpoint of disaggregating privileges. We talk about masculine privilege, we talk about white privilege, we talk about class privilege, Christian privilege, and we disaggregated it. And then we got into this confusing complexity related to intersecting privileges and oppressions and where that happens and when it doesn't happen. And we started to confuse that kind of privilege and power with oppression with a larger notion of intersectionality. And the mixing of privilege and power is not intersectionality, but that's for another webinar at some other point. So, but you know, you end up thinking, oh, you know, I have privilege as a man, I have a privilege as social class. And so these particular ideas of privilege make sense to you because you feel like you've earned them, or that they're attached to particular identities that we have. And so one day as I was walking to my car on a sidewalk, staying in my lane, what I encountered was coming down towards me were a group of white college students. I assume that the white college students are going to the student activity center down the street from us. And when we walked up to each other on the sidewalk, they expected me to move. They weren't going to move. They expected me to move. Now, for me, I felt like I was fulfilling my sort of social compact on the sidewalk because I stayed in my lane. I was close to I was, you know, following directions and doing what I was supposed to do. But they didn't really care. They saw the sidewalk as their space. They saw me as the interloper. They saw me as somebody that needed to move because they were there, right? And so that perspective about the sidewalk is a small example, but that perspective about the sidewalk also shows that the legacy, the inheritance of whiteness for white people comes from settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is simply the idea that you can move onto land, take the land, steal the land, and that space is yours to do what you want with, right? And so that particular perspective about white space and owning white space is still very prominent. And so white spaces is what we're getting at. And where do Asian Americans fit into perpetuating and maintaining those white spaces? And in what ways do we keep those spaces white? But also, what do we get out of it? But also, what are the costs associated with it? So some of the costs associated with it might be that we learn to be in those spaces and we learn to support white spaces through experiences of acculturation. And I say acculturation meaning that we learn it through direct and vicarious experiences with racism. We don't have to necessarily experience a directly racism. We can see somebody else experience that racism. We can learn that in order to be in a particular white space, we have to be a particular way. And most often that particular way is to be innocuous, right? To be quiet. And you can be the visible racial person in that white space that also serves the role of interpreting racism, but also consoling and taking care of white feelings in those spaces as well. So if the white person in that white space engages in something racist, we as the model minority in those white spaces console and interpret racism for them so that they feel better, so that we maintain our positionality in those spaces. Often that's the case. And so we talk about acculturation as the main teaching tool of white supremacy. How else do you learn to be an American for a person of color than through the process of acculturation? Acculturation is not an innocuous experience. It is racism, it's racial trauma, it's microaggressions, it's all those aspects where we learn to be a minority person, a person of color in predominantly white spaces. And if we understand that racism is permanent and that white supremacy is certainly behind it all, we also have to understand that as Asian Americans, we can never be on par with white people in those spaces, right? Because white supremacy disallows it. We can approximate it, but the point in time where we try to be on an equal footing is when we start to experience what we consider to be those contingencies start to be enacted and those privileges starting to be pulled away. And so you start to lose your positionality potentially because you dare to see yourself as equal to a white person in those spaces, right? And so you might be considered, the model minority, but another way to describe it against, let's say, an anti-Black way of describing it would be considered that you're too uppity in those spaces. You're not allowed to do that in those spaces. And as Asian Americans in those places as well, we should also recognize that we potentially are racial competitors too. So in those times and in those places where progressive or liberal white people want to see and make friends and be friends with Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities, we become competitors in those spaces as well. And so we have to be very careful. We have to understand what it means to have these proxy privileges, to be Asian Americans within these predominantly white spaces. So I'm going to turn it over to Rossina to finish out the last slide.
Thank you. So perhaps one of the most common concerns centering Asian Americans in racial justice work is the question of whether we have a seat at the table. A similar question that often comes about as well is, why are we not included in these conversations about racism and oppression? Yet these questions, in all of their assumptions, miss the mark. Such questions revert us back to deeming racism as individual acts of malice and intent among BIPOC communities, rather than addressing structural and systemic racism within the context of white supremacy. Such questions assume a very base level of anti-racism as diversity and representation. They reveal the ways that we struggle to see ourselves as part of a collective of people of color who are prescribed particular functions and roles to uphold and perpetuate white supremacy and anti-Blackness. As Asian Americans, we must be explicit and intentional and adamant about our commitment to the freedom of our BIPOC communities in ways that does not overlook how we exist as members of the BIPOC communities and how we are linked within systems of oppression that is the history of dehumanization in the US. For us as Asian Americans committed to racial justice, it is not a matter of to have or not to have a seat at the table, but rather it is a question of which table and whose table are we requesting to be seated at. Earlier this presentation, we noted that where we start will determine where we end up. And so asking which table and whose table we are requesting to be seated at takes us down a completely different course and therefore outcomes. Asking which table and whose is not just about participating in anti-racist work. Asking which table and whose is a call for freedom and liberation for BIPOC communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and just kind of laying a very important, I think, foundation and groundwork for, I guess, future conversations that we will be able to have. So we have several questions, and so I think I will start with this one because it may dovetail nicely to what was just discussed. So from Tara Brown, the question is, some anti-Blackness theorists situate race ethnic privilege not within proximity to whiteness, but within distance from Blackness. What are the implications of this perspective in terms of our understanding of quote unquote proxy privilege?
Please, no, go for it.
You take it.
Well, I'll start part of it. I think one of the one way to think about it for Asian Americans is that but related to this idea of us as perpetual foreigners, one way that we can demonstrate our Americanness is to participate in anti-Blackness. And that's a way for us to distance ourselves from what we consider to be a racial category that is inhabited or is defined by everything that's negative about being a person, a person. And so that's how I'd answer it.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I don't think that it's, okay, so I actually have a diagram that I drew out, but I don't have access to it right now. But I don't think that, I think it is true, steering away from Blackness. Anti-Blackness is to keep away from Blackness, right? To steer ourselves away from it. But I think that within the framework that we're working under with whiteness and white supremacy as superior and as the power source, then where else do they divert to? Where else do people go if they're just shunning away from Blackness? It's not that they're just going away into an abyss. They're going towards something else. They're going toward power. The reason why people are anti-Black, or well, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons that they do it is not because just out of hate, although that is the case. In terms of functionality, they're doing it in order to gain material gains, right? So that power source is toward that whiteness, wherever that power is. In this country, it is white supremacy. So I don't think that you can just shun away from it and go nowhere. You're going somewhere with it. So that's how I would respond to that.
Mm-hmm. And the proxy privileges are very much, as Rossina was saying, very much tied up with material rewards. It's not just a good feeling that you get as a reward for proxy privileges, but it does come with positionality in white institutions and white organizations. It does come with certain material rewards. And so we have to think about participating in racism and anti-Blackness in particular, is specifically that it does come with material gains for those who engage in that activity. And one of those gains is the continued positionality within certain structures and organizations. And it's the continuation of one's proxy privileges, right? The feeling that one belongs and one fits into those places.
I also want to just think this question, Dr. Brown, that you've posed also makes me think about the relationship within BIPOC communities, right? That when people of color are enacting anti-Blackness, that it's not in this vacuum of, I want to emphasize on this power source, right? I think that it's kind of like the conversation with the difference between anti-Asian racism versus anti-Asian violence. Those are not the same in the way that we're thinking about structurally, right? Because anti-Asian violence can happen among BIPOC communities, and that carries a lot of harm, but not institutional or structural harm. That also doesn't carry institutional or structural rewards within communities. So it has to be in proximity to white power, in the sense that that's where the power is. So if we're thinking about proxy privileges as gaining material or losing it, then that source has to be identified. We'll have this conversation somewhere. I know we will.
Well, I think related to that, there's a couple of people who have asked kind of a question related to this. So the idea is, what are your thoughts on Dr. Kendi's work on anti-racism, and particularly his notion that BIPOC individuals can also be racist? And so a related question was, someone was like, well, then how do we explain that all of the racism I've experienced have been from non-white people?
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to the whole notion of racism as institutional and structural. Yes, you've experienced a lot of prejudice and anti-Asian violence or sentiments, but it cannot be conflated with something where we're talking about structures. But I'm going to let William answer Kendi's situation.
Well, I think that particular point comes from Kendi's book on how to be anti-racist. And I think the book is remarkable and terrific in many different ways. And the only point of departure that I have is really, in a sense, to question this idea of whether people of color within communities of color can be racist. I think certainly we can engage in discrimination because we identify, let's say in this particular context of anti-COVID race violence, we can identify people who are Asian and therefore engage in violence against them. But the way I like to describe it is that I think we need to reserve and keep the term racism as a term to describe white institutional power, and not to distribute it as a form of interpersonal violence or interpersonal discrimination. And I think that's the particular point that Kendi's book works on, is that I think, he's focused on in the book, how do individuals become anti-racist? And so because he sort of focused on at the individual level, then without sort of acknowledging or recognizing institutional and structural racism, you can get into these problems of thinking about racism as just interpersonal prejudice and biases. But in that way, I think he's also engaged in a conversation about racism that is the current discourse around racism, that, you know, anytime that anything happens, especially among communities of color, that anybody can be racist. Now, on the flip side of that is that the problem is that then anybody can deny being racist, and then we don't have any sense of what racism means. And then related to that particular problem is that if everybody can be racist, then we really get into this other confusing sort of semantic theoretical issue of what reverse racism is. And then we completely move off of what racism is and the function of racism. And as Love and Muhammad's piece is, it has to be historically accurate. Saying that everybody can be racist is not historically accurate. It's also not related to critical race. It really has almost no basis in any kind of sort of anti-racist, anti-Black theory, because it moves us to this individual basis. And the only people that it really benefits is people who are white, if we think about anybody who can be racist, because then it sort of, you know, moves the conversation away from whiteness and white supremacy towards this other notion that anybody can be racist.
I think the idea of focusing on the interpersonal also is banking on the idea of goodwill and good intentions and the preservation of white innocence. So what I mean by that, in teacher education, for example, we're constantly saying, if you're good and you have good intentions, that's good. That's a good thing, right? Well, that's a given. You should be kind. You should do it. That's not a reward. What we can't be banking on people's goodwill and intentions for change. It has to be translated to material gains or losses. If we start seeing it that way, then we can, then curriculum wise, right? You can't say, okay, the curriculum, if it's just a matter of good teaching and kindness toward one another, then you're not thinking about curriculum. You're not thinking about all these ways that education is a form of whiteness as property, and it is to be protected and maintained for whiteness. And so I think the critique of racism as structural has to be centered as part of this conversation, rather than looking at interpersonal exchanges. And I'm not a big fan of thinking about it as goodwill and good intentions. You should be good. That's all there is to it. You should just do the right thing. That doesn't mean, a lot of teachers think they're doing the right thing and they still do harm. So that's where our push for this conversation of, let's just keep it in this conversation of structural and also agents of the institution. That means, how are you aligned with the institution, your proximity to that, and therefore you become the actors of what the institution expects and wants.
Thank you. So there was a couple of questions asking for, I think, a little bit more discussion around this, to question whose table, all right, that you're we're asking to be at. And so one person asked, is it a call to center the fight against anti-Blackness without a perpetual knee-jerk, what about me? Or why is it so, this language of symbolic representation remains so common and persistent?
I don't understand that question.
Or like, so let me clarify that a little bit. So, because Janelle asks, I agree with the critique of the "we need, deserve a seat at the table" demand. This language is sometimes used by Asian Americans to avoid confronting anti-Blackness. So I've also seen Asian Americans forefront a complaint about not being consulted in discussions about racial inequality in a similar fashion. Can you speak a bit more on why this language of symbolic representation remains so common and is rarely challenged?
Mm-hmm. Do you have a thought?
Well, not directly to that, but
Mm-hmm.
I need time to think, so
Okay.
you can.
Okay. I'm going to try to answer it, but as I often do, I'm going to answer it obtusely. So here we go. So I think the forefronting of Black and Indigenous as a position to confront racism and inequality in our society means that we also, as people of color, as Asian Americans, have to start to shed the ways that we've internalized white anxieties and white standards. And so let me just talk a little bit about this. The idea of representation and being consulted and those kinds of issues is in some ways related to the fear that Black liberation, issues around indigeneity, land, that the movement to center that will somehow ignore us, that it doesn't involve us, that somehow Black liberation doesn't mean liberation for Asian and Brown and Indigenous peoples, right? And there's no history of that. There's no historical reference for that, in the sense that movements for civil rights and movements for Black liberation have excluded Asians and Indigenous and Brown people. It's been a movement to liberate all people's communities of color. So where does that anxiety come from? That anxiety, that fear that forefronting Black issues or Black liberation doesn't include us only goes to one place. And that is how deeply we have inculcated and internalized white supremacist epistemological points of view and values, that we believe that for some reason we won't be included. And I just firmly don't see that as a concern. We forefront liberation. The fight against anti-Blackness is a global fight for all of us, and that's the piece I think that we need to look at it. So it's a different way to answer, because that particular question about representation, comes from well, like I said, a particular sort of white anxiety, a fear that they're going to be that one gain for one group, it's a zero-sum game. There's only racial zero-sum games only make sense in a white epistemological frame, right? Because white supremacy sees race as a competition against different groups, and gains for one doesn't necessarily means losses for whiteness, right? So let me stop there. But
I think you answered that question well. I think what I would add is the idea of walking away from that big table, right? I think a lot of times we're still working on this idea that, so anti-racist work is still in response to racism, is to be anti that, right? It's to not be racist, to move forward, to be proactive about. But if racism keeps mutating and keeps changing, right, then we're always playing the catching up game. So for me, the table has to be a different table. It has to be a table where we sit and discuss liberation and not discuss how do we respond to racism and find ourselves within secondary status, right? And working with that. The movement has to be at a different space. Changing that is changing the narrative. It's not about participating in the dominant narrative, but to truly counter it is to change the core and the question and the center and what is to be focused. So I think moving toward that liberation is the table that I want to be seated at.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
So related to that, there's been several questions about when you define, the different, Asian American centric or Asian centric,
Mhm.
there's been several questions about kind of the internal diversity
Mhm.
within Asian American, right, as a term. So somebody pointedly asked, Madiha Moyne asked, following the George Floyd protests and uptick of conversations on social media about racism, Asian American conversations over social media were self-examining how communities engage in inner conflicts such as colorism with
Mhm.
Asian communities. Are these types of conversations taking away from the greater conversation of anti-Blackness, or is it related? And so I think a lot of people are wanting to would like you to kind of engage in this question of kind of internal diversity, and is it, when you talk about Asian American or Asian, are you including, all groups from all different countries of origin, and to discuss or to be engaged in these types of conversations about the diversity within? Is it taking away, or is it related to this overall or more general conversation about anti-Blackness?
Um, well, I think we have to engage in all those conversations simultaneously. I mean, so my sense of when we were trying to establish Asian American studies, you have to have all of those different levels of conversation constantly, right? As well as those conversations of coalition building outside. So it's this constant effort. So, in this way, it's an everyday, every moment effort to combat these multiple layers of marginalization, oppression, and racism. So it's constantly ever going, right? So as psychologists, we call it sort of racial battle fatigue, or, and because we're constantly engaged in this, right? It's the emotional labor that we're constantly engaged in as part of these conversations, and we have to have them at multiple levels. But we really have to do better at seeing how a conversation around colorism also is in fact related to anti-Blackness, right? So you certainly can't have a conversation over here. I think many Asian Americans have had this conversation of, let's say who your partner is supposed to be. And in many Asian American communities, the lighter the skin, the better. And so that's a piece of it that happens, that's sort of part of that happens out here, right? That happens in these in our countries of origin, for instance. It has roots in colonialism, it has all roots in imperialism, it has all of those pieces. And then having those conversations about colorism, the idea of who you're supposed to date, who you're supposed to be partnered with, and lighter skin also is also amplified among Asian Americans when we talk about who you're supposed to be with, right? And so most Asian Americans have had this racial hierarchy sort of built into them that if you can't be with somebody who's within your ethnic group or Asian, a lighter skinned Asian, then white is next best. But you never should bring home somebody who's Black, right? And so those conversations about colorism find amplification in anti-Blackness in our conversations in the US. So I think I think what I want to get at is just the sense that we have to have those multiple conversations. We have to see how they intersect. And that's the point that we were getting at, is that there's multiple intersections, multiple divergences. And in those intersections and divergences, we do find opportunities for different answers, right? But ultimately, those conversations have to center around the prominence of white supremacy and the intransigence of racism in our society, right? So we can't just talk about it as individual preferences or familial dispositions. We really have to situate them in an overall sort of racial dynamic.
Yeah, what you just said. But I think if I'm gonna summarize that, is how are you gonna make sense of it? How are you gonna synthesize it, right? So that all conversations should happen. They need to happen. Okay, so it's not about the censorship of should I or shouldn't have these conversations, but it's how that process, right? How are you gonna process it and see it in intersecting ways? How do you talk about it in similar to ways that we've just articulated here in this webinar on it's not just about this interpersonal, but then what are the wider contexts of it, so that we're not just talking about these individual notions of like sentiments that we have toward one another, but how is it functioning? How does it operate, and why? Why do we subscribe to it? What do we gain when we subscribe to it? How does that make you exist in this space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those kinds of preferences, like let's say colorism, the biases, cannot be just simply compartmentalized when we think about it as a component within an overall racial system. You just can't say, oh, I have a particular sort of preference for lighter skin just among Asian Americans. That doesn't work out, because it's generalizable within a racial framework, within our racialized society. Those things are, like I said, find energy, get amplified, and take root, mostly because anti-Blackness is so prominent in our society.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions here who are, I think, asking for maybe more action items or how we could approach this. So someone asked, in your opinion, what are the primary challenges for the Asian American community in anti-racist and anti-Blackness work? And what would be your corresponding recommendations for such challenges? And I think there was another question asking about, well, how do we have these types of conversations, maybe outside of the academy or in our communities? That's in a way that can be understandable.
That's a good point, and how to be understandable, because I think that we end up talking amongst ourselves and using these giant jargony terms, and I am guilty of that. So my apologies for that.
Me too.
You especially.
Yeah.
But
yes.
And super passive voice. I don't know why he does that, but super passive voice. So I think, so one of the way that I don't know what the biggest challenges are, other than the questions that I posed in this presentation of, how do we participate and having that space where we're not sure of our positionality, like how do we get in, right? So this conversation we've also had with some of our friends, and one of the things that it makes me think about is when we start feeling uncomfortable and not sure if we should have this conversation, I think there's a need for us to always be heard too, and sometimes it's completely appropriate to also just sit back and listen and earn your membership into a space. Right? And that process of earning that membership takes commitment. It's not about coming in and expecting to be accepted immediately. That's a framework that I think we need to all, that's taking on, there's always an expectation, for example, that Black people should always just accept you. They don't have to, right? People don't have to do anything. And I think that we have to reframe how we're seeing ourselves and our positionality, and really think, how do we earn our place, or how do we earn membership into a conversation? What have you done? Like, I mean, sometimes people are like, well, I just don't feel like I'm allowed to talk about it. Well, how often do you talk about it? If you're really committed to this work, I don't know that is a real issue, right? If you are involved in communities of color and having these conversations, I don't know that saying, oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to even talk about or enter this space is even a real question, because that doesn't happen. It happens because when it happens, I think you need to ask, well, how much have I committed to this space? And how have I positioned myself when I entered these spaces? You know, that's the assumption that I always feel like we forget, that, well, I want a part of that conversation. How come I'm not heard? Well, how often do you participate in this? And how much have you committed to forging and fostering these relationships with other members in the BIPOC community? Have you sat and really listened? Do you enter any of the white spaces thinking that? No, you still got to earn your place there too. So that's something that I think that the expectation is different for some reason when we're talking about, oh, racialized spaces. How come I'm not allowed? Well, how much have you worked for it? So.
Yes. What comes to mind is that many Asian American organizations have started these conversations about, let's say, Black Lives Matter, and they've initiated these actions to try to inform and try to explain Black Lives Matter to their aunties and uncles and family members, and you know, and it can work. It does work. The last time we were in California, my mom, 76 years old, was interested in understanding Black Lives Matter. Just a question. And we engaged in that conversation. Rossina did a really nice job of explaining Black Lives Matter to my mom. And, you know, she was interested, in part because I think part of it also was because this was part of an ongoing conversation that she knows that we engage in, that she wants to be a part of as well. I also think it's okay to recognize that there are people and communities and groups that are not interested in these conversations, and to that end, sometimes it's just not worth it. It's just not worth the time, because, you know, you could be using your time to organize. You'd be spending your energy in cross-racial collaborations, moving other communities forward, and knowing where your strengths are. Sometimes that's just not where your strength lies, right? It's not the place that you want to devote your energy. However, there are other Asian Americans that get really enlivened by that kind of challenge, and they will dive in and have those conversations. So it's really important to have an array of Asian Americans who not only have multiple interests, but also have multiple strengths. And some are better at coalition building, some are better at engaging and confronting our Asian American community members who are just explicitly and unapologetically anti-Black. And we have to engage in all of those conversations simultaneously, right? And we have to figure out like what our place is, what we do well, and what we can do, and where we can collaborate. Um, so that's my takeaway, is knowing what your strengths are, and knowing what you can do well, and making sure that you surround yourself with other people that can also engage in other multiple conversations too.
Great, thank you. So related to that, we have so many wonderful questions, but I think this might have to be the last one because a lot of the others are rather specific. So we'll keep the questions and have you look at them afterwards. But someone asked, and I guess looking at the flip side, what needs to change in academia as it relates to this conversation? We're saying outside, but now we're saying, well, within, where do we start?
Mm-hmm.
Or where do we go?
Please, my better half.
I definitely think the academy needs to change, and myself included in terms, again, of jargons. I think we need to recenter who gets to be the knowledge makers. I think that we have to do a better job of what it means to bring in counter narratives and to learn from the counter narratives. It needs to be that the knowledge makers are the students in the classroom, right? The students in our schools, Black and Brown students and Asian American students, listening to their perspectives and how they can teach us. We are always positioning ourselves as the people who produce the knowledge, but that cannot be farther from the truth. We stay within our own silos, we talk to each other, and then we give each other hand claps. I think that piece has to happen. I know that the work of my esteemed colleagues, and I'm just gonna throw out Dr. Tara Brown again, because she's giving me a hard time. She does participatory action research, right? And that really challenges who actually participates in the making of that knowledge, of that research knowledge, that scholarship. So I think that that's the space we have to begin.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that as well. I think that's sort of changing our epistemological stance. I think the piece that I would add to that in terms of institutional how institutions work in particular, is that we have to start the conversation from a different place. It's sort of where we started our conversation today. We have to start at a different place. We have to start with a different assumption. If we start the assumption, or we start the place of conversation about how to change our institutions to be racially just, but we start from a place of economics and where our budget is, we will definitely end up in a place where nothing changes, because we automatically have started in a place where money and the finances become the central feature in terms of what we want to do. And when it comes to money and finances, it is a proxy way that we think about power, and money and finances are never distributive towards liberation. They're always conservative towards centralizing power. And so starting a conversation around money and budgets and trying to move towards a racially just place, you're not going to get there, because money is a proxy for a conversation around power. Power within white institutions is always central pedal. It comes in, it's conservative, it maintains the status quo. It's never going to be liberatory and outward. So we really have to start the conversation elsewhere. And so that means practically, when we think about hiring people who are going to be academic leaders, we need to stop thinking about people who have strong backgrounds in business and finance and those kinds of things as a way to move us towards liberation, because that's not necessarily the case. And so we really have to think about people who are grounded in liberation and emancipation and anti-racism. Those are the folks that are also super smart around budgets and can move budgets to meet those particular ends. But if we start with money first, we will end up with conservation of money. So I'll end there.
Thank you. So much food for thought. If all of the audience members can join me in thanking once again our two wonderful speakers and just giving us a lot to think about and mull over. And I'm hoping that this is just the start of the dialogue that we can have, you know, amongst and across groups. And we also want to thank the audience members for attending, especially on a Monday. But we thank everyone for their very engaging questions and just for being engaged in this type of dialogue. Thank you once again, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.